Hi class, welcome to lesson 2 of our flipped classroom. Now in the last lesson we learned that drawing is a global skill, which means it's made up of several smaller skills, and today we're going to learn what those skills are. Now you may think that the skills I'm talking about are how to hold your pencil just right so that when you rub it against the paper, a drawing will just appear that looks great. Well, that is a big part of it, but even more important is what you do with these. Your eyes are going to be the biggest tool that you need to be able to draw. And of course your brain, but your eyes will give information to your brain about what you see. And until your brain understands what your eyes are seeing, you will not be able to draw what it is you want to draw. So we call these skills perceptual skills. All right, I want you to write down this definition and how to spell it. Perceptual skills. They're skills that involve observing, perceiving, and understanding things that we can see. All right, so we're going to learn 5 of these today. And before I start, I just want to show you why seeing things is so important. Anyone can draw something that represents something. So I can go like this. Here, I'll show you. I can draw this, and you will understand that it's supposed to be a flower because it's a symbol of a flower that most people would understand. However, I may not know, or you may not know by looking at this flower, exactly what kind of flower I'm trying to show you. If I were trying to show you a real flower, I would need to be much more specific about many aspects of the flower so that you understand which flower I'm trying to draw. So if I took this flower, for instance, right here, if I took this flower and I want to represent it in a realistic way to communicate to you who's looking at my drawing what this flower looks like, I'm going to need to use the 5 perceptual skills of drawing. And I'm going to give you a quick overview. First of all, I need to understand the edges and how they move and go in and out and change as it goes around the outside part of this flower, so that I can show you how the flower actually looks. So when I start looking at the flower, I realize that the edges are not as perfect as my other drawing. They're actually really much more interesting than perfect, because perfect can be a little boring sometimes, let's face it. Real life is always more interesting than some symbol that we can come up with. All right? So you can kind of see how this edge is much more specific to this actual flower than this one was. Okay, this is a very general flower. This is a symbolic flower, but this is an actual real flower. Okay, once I've done the edge, I would look at the space or shape that is made up of, the flower is made up of inside. There are lots of littler spaces in, like every petal has a shape to it and represents a space. It has a height, it has a width. All right, so I would need to check and make sure that as I draw this, that all of my spaces are represented correctly. Right? So as I start to put more edges down, I'm going to start dividing this flower up into spaces. Okay? I also am going to look at all the different relationships inside this flower, and I will explain what that means. The relationships are how the different parts all relate to one another and to the whole. All right, to the flower as a whole. So that's another perceptual skill, is noticing how things relate to one another. Like for instance, is one of these petals bigger than another? Are some of them closer together, or are some overlapping and other ones are spread apart? That is what you need to start to see. And then another thing you might see is light and shadow on the flower. Now, see how this little petal is curled over, so light is going to be hitting the top of the petal, but it's going to create a little shadow here. And if I were drawing this with my pencil, I would maybe put a little bit of shadow in here, all right? And then of course, the last one is just understanding the whole flower all at once, and then looking at my drawing and asking myself, did I represent the whole flower correctly? Okay, so that's the overview. Now we're going to go through the perceptual skills one at a time. All right, number one. Got a little dirty, sorry. Number one is the perception of edges. So make sure you write that in your notes. And yes, you will be quizzed on it. So the perception of edges is edges, and I'll use a simpler object than a flower in order to show you what I mean by edges. An edge is where it's a border between the object you're drawing and everything else around it. So where the object ends and then everything else begins, that would be an edge. Okay, sounds pretty obvious, but you need to be able to see the edge and understand it before you can draw it. Okay, so this is a simple object. When I look at the edges of this object, I see that they're curved on the top and the bottom. And I see that they end in 2 points on the ends, okay? I'm gonna actually show you how I would draw this using rope. So, if my camera person could raise up the camera, and I will show you how I will use this rope to represent the object. Okay, so here I have a board, and I'm not saying you should draw this way, but I am just doing this to prove a point. So this is not how we're gonna be drawing in class, although we might do it. Might be kind of fun. Give you guys a bunch of yarn and make you make some edges. I think that could be fun, actually. See, that's the kind of thing we would do in a flipped classroom. You wouldn't have to hear me talk about this. You'd already know about it. So then I'll give you some yarn and you'll already know what I need you to do with the yarn. You'll already understand it. That is the whole point of a flipped classroom. We can actually do fun stuff in class. All right, so here I've made the best I can do of the shape of the object. Okay, and I'm not even going to call it a football, because when I say football, the wrong side of my brain starts to kick in, because there is a side of our brain that's perfectly fine. You remember that flower I drew that was a symbol? Do you remember this flower? There's a part of our brain which thinks this flower is fine. As soon as it can identify that this is a flower, it's done. It's like, okay, I'm done. But there's another side of our brain, which I'm going to tell you all about in a future lesson. There's a side of our brain which appreciates every little detail about this exact flower and isn't happy with this. It wants to explore what makes this flower very unique and special. So I'm not going to call this a football, because as soon as I say football, you might be expecting a symbol of a football. Well, a football is a very simple shape, but let's not call it a football. Let's just call it an object. Because whenever you're drawing something, whatever you're drawing is the object you're drawing. Okay. Now, the edges of this are very simple. But if I were going to make the edge of this plant right here, these plants, do you see how complicated that edge would be? There are so many ins and outs as the edge goes up, down, and all around all of these leaves that it would be an extremely complex, not impossible, but very challenging, complex edge to try to capture. Okay, so let's go back to our nice, simple edges of our football. Okay, so the reason we can tell this is a football, or an object shaped like a football, is that it has some kind of border, which we're going to use a pencil and lines to usually represent. A border from what is the object and what's all around the object. So that is what edges are all about. Now the next thing I'm going to teach you is very, very closely connected with edges, and they can't really be separated. So one needs the other, okay? All right, and the next one I'm going to teach you is, number 2, is the perception of spaces or shapes, okay? Spaces or shapes. All right, so write that down. In this object, there is space in here. Now that space allows us to understand what this object is. Because look what would happen if this space didn't exist. If this space wasn't here, look what would happen to these edges. The edges would be all mushed together, and without the space around in between them and even around them, all this is a line and it's just a mess. It doesn't really explain or describe really anything except maybe a snake, but that's not what we're drawing, right? Okay, so I need the space to open up in here. I need to be able to understand and perceive the space between these edges in order to make these edges in the right place. Because without understanding the space inside, I might make this object too wide, I might make it too skinny, I might not get the curves right. So the edges, the spaces are crucial to understand. And, you know, do you remember when someone taught you how to cross a street? Are you supposed to only look one way when you cross the street? No, right? Someone taught you to look both ways before you cross the street. So drawing is like that. If you only focus on one of these perceptual skills that I'm about to teach you, you will miss major things that you're supposed to be looking out for. So it's just like crossing, if you're about to cross the street, if you only look one way and then you just cross, something could be coming from the other way, right? And it'll get you. And the same thing with drawing. If you don't pay attention to all 5 of the things that I'm going to show you, then your drawing could be detoured by something and you won't understand, well, you will understand what it was and then you can fix it and it's no big deal. In fact, mistakes are the best way to learn. Okay, so we're back with our object, right? And here's my object. Okay, so even though this object isn't white, I can ignore some of the details of the things on this object in order to understand the height of it, the width of it, and just the way it gets wider here and then it gets narrower here. These are all things, these are all aspects of this space, the way that it changes. It gets widest here, then it gets narrower till it comes to a point. These are the aspects I need to be able to see to be able to draw this properly. Okay, so, oh, and there's another really great trick. Did you know that spaces are not just inside an object? There are important spaces outside the object as well. Now, I want you to do this on your paper. Quickly draw this object, just simple, with just the edge and of course the space. And then I want you to do something around the object. I'm going to take another piece of rope and I'm going to make a rectangle around this. I want you, with your pencil or pen, to draw a rectangle that is tightly wrapped around this. And what I mean by that is the rectangle is going to touch, it's going to touch the object here, here, hold on, it's got to turn the corner, it's got to touch here. You're going to be doing this with your pencil. Trust me, it's a lot easier with a pencil. And let's pretend this is a straight rectangle. It's going to touch here. It's basically going to touch on all the points of the object. Let's see if I can get this to come around. Okay, so here's my rectangle. This is what I want you to do. Okay, does that look kind of like a rectangle? Good enough. Well, anyway, the point is I want you to make a rectangle that touches here, 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 and here. And now I would like you to look at the spaces that we just created around this object. 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. And these spaces are super helpful when you're trying to draw the object because you can use them. They're almost like jigsaw puzzle pieces that interlock with the object itself. So all the spaces around, there's a fancy name for them. It's called negative space. We're going to learn about that in a much future lesson. But for right now, understand that spaces are not just within an object, they're also around an object. And what I want you to do is I want you to color these in, all right? So with your pencil, I want you to color